mute their mics then.
Right, well, what I'm going to just talk about this evening is doing what it says on there, but this is a bit of a unique slant on it. I mean, when you look at mobile operating, perhaps for most people, it's VHF or perhaps UHF. So you've got fairly small aerials, quarter waves on 2 meters, are unobtrusive. I know some people go for slightly bigger aerials. I've seen 7/8, but they're not massive. But if you start looking at the HF bands, I mean, even on 10 meters, you're talking of a quarter wave 9 feet and more, roughly. If you're talking of 160 meters, you're talking of something 120 feet long. So for verticals, it's not on. And you need a little bit more in the way of technique as well to work on those bands. So what I'm doing is describing something that I did nearly 40 years ago with a group of fellow amateurs and real ale drinkers. So mobile work, what do you need really if you're on the HF bands? Well, you need good earth and grounding system. It's essential that you get that right. It's not all easy with modern cars, I know. When I'm going back to this one, it was a bit easier. But you need a good earth. You need to run a bit of power, 50 watts or more, otherwise you're lost. You need a decent aerial system. And you need good matching. So if you're going to work on these bands, you're going to have shortened aerials, which means you're not going to be able to operate across the width of a lot of these bands. So you're always going to be compromised. I guess it's like any aerial that's going to be shortened, it's going to be a compromise. So there we are, quarter wave on 40 meters, about 33 feet long. Well. And a reliable power supply. Certainly if you're in a car, if you're whacking this sort of power out, you don't want to be stalling too often. Well, let's just have a look at a trip that I did nearly 40 years ago with a group of people, with the late Steve Lawrence, G4EOF, my good self, husband and wife, Judith and Dave Brooks, and another friend of ours, Graham. And we went out as a group, but not in a car. We went in a canal boat, and we did this journey from Knapton to Evesham. Doesn't sound far if you look at by car, but it's a canal. We did it by canal. We went on the Oxford Canal, the Grand Union Canal, the Stratford Canal, and the River Avon. Doesn't sound, and we came back, which is the important thing, because we'd hired a boat. So if you just look at the journey, we went for a week. I don't think our livers could have taken any longer, but we went for a week. And we traversed, I totaled 178 locks. Well, any of you have ever been on the canals, half a dozen locks is hard work. We've got this Hatton flight where you've got about 20 plus of them, almost one after the other. So the majority of locks, we were on the Grand Union and Stratford Canals. And the Grand Union Canal's an up and down canal. First you're up in the air and you're down, then back up again. So it was 104 miles. Total journey I estimated. So as you can see, a lock about every half mile. But there were plenty of ale stops included. So we came well armed with the right sort of guides, the Nicholson's Guide to the Canal and the Warwickshire Real Ale Guide, which in those days was pretty thin. So you had to do a lot of planning if you wanted a decent drink. And you probably can see here, here's the part of the, here we are starting about here, going all this way, down the Stratford Canal, onto the River Avon, and back along here. Well, we hired the boat from what is now this boat company. I've forgotten what it was called. Well, a bit of good fun, you might say, but quite a lot of hard work. So what did we take? Well, for the HF bands, we took my old IC 701. I bought this in 1978 at the Leicester show, and I was assured by one or two locals that it wouldn't last very long. Well, it lasted a long, long time. It ran off its own power supply, which was 18 volts, but it would run off 12 volts. And it's probably the best receiver I've ever had. I was able to work stuff on 40 meters from home. In those days, you had to put up with Radio Tirana on 7060 in the evenings, broadcasting illegally. Ironically, I think it was last year, was it the year before? It was last year, wasn't it? I actually saw where Radio Tirana was in Tirana. And we used a G-whip and a mag mount. And the mag mount was made from a coil, an old magnet from out of an old speaker, large speaker. On VHF, we had a 7/8 vertical. So we were pretty well equipped. So we had a solid state rig running off 12 volts. The IC 701 did 160 meters to 10 meters. Those days we didn't have the WARC bands, the 10 megs, 18 megs and 24 megs. What do we use for power supply? Well, we're on a boat, so it lends itself to tapping into the power supply. And we got some heavy duty power cable from another friend of ours that worked in the power industry. And we attached this to the boat batteries. There were two large batteries in the boat, so power was not a problem. Mind you, we did all this after we left the boatyard, well out of sight. What's a G-whip? Well, it's a compromise aerial. They don't see them these days, but I think there's parts of mine are still with my friends in Loughborough. There were coils for 10, 15 and 20 meters, and you could adjust them. There was a little screw at the end, and you could get them to resonate on certain parts of the band. On top of that, you could put another coil and whip and get a fourth band. So you could operate 4 bands without changing the aerial. And what we did was that we had, I had made some whips for the coils for 160, 80 and 40 meters that resonated on those frequencies, because we wanted to activate some worked all Britain areas in those days, not like it is today. That included the 10 kilometre square plus the county. So it was a 4-band aerial. So while we were out chugging around, we could switch between 10, 15 and 20 and or 160, 80 and 40. So it worked. So there we are, there's a G-whip. As you can see, the 3 coils you can see horizontally are for the 3 higher frequencies, and there's the coil and whip for the lower frequency. And Graham G4GEE was a very keen kayaker, so we took that as well. Probably can just about see the VHF aerial. So there's the LF coil and whip. It's a helical whip. Well, luckily, here we are mobile. We've got good grounding and earth because we've got dirty grate steel canal boat. Just the job. They've got a large ground plane there. I've forgotten the length of the boat. It was a 6 berth. Can't remember how long it was, too long ago. So you've got steel hull as well, and you've got a reliable power supply system, twin 12-volt battery system on the boat with a lot of oomph. And of course, we're constantly charging up as we're chugging along. So there we are. The Icon IC701 could cheerfully put out 100 watts, no problem. It actually did a bit more on 160, but in those days we were limited to 10 watts. So there's a basically good system. Compromise aerials. So how did we get on? Well, why we chose the G-whip was that a lot of people have worked for activating work toward Britain areas, favoured it. So we'd got experience and from people that had been at it a lot longer than I. I mean, I was licensed on the HF bands. Oh God, I can't remember now. Was it 1977? Steve, the late G4EOF, I think 1972. So, but we did listen to a lot of the more experienced people, and they recommended this as an aerial. And here we are. You can see a slightly younger version of my good self. Not much has changed, apart from the hair. Here's my old IC701, and I am twiddling away. And another example. Well, we had a lot of interesting QSOs. One of them, we got into the river lock at Stratford. As you come, you have to go through a couple of, well, a lock to get from the Stratford Canal onto the River Avon. And then as you come past the theatre, there's a lock on the river, which I think in those days were hand operated. Well, one morning, Steve, who used to get up very early, was determined he was going to work into the Antipodes. And sure enough, we had clatter, clatter, clatter as the aerial was put back up on the roof. As we were, I can't remember who the mug was that had to get the boat going. Probably wasn't me. And we came to the river lock, and there were a group of CBers there. And they said, who are you talking to? Well, whatever the language is. And we said, Christchurch. I said, oh, that's a nice part of Hampshire. We said, oh, no, not Christchurch, Hampshire, Christchurch in New Zealand. Well, load of skepticism, but Steve did make it, and we did get a QSL card from the station. I think they were a bit surprised. Well, en route, we worked a lot of North Americans because 10 meters was open. 10 and 15 were very good. So we were working a lot of American stations. Interestingly, we did work one American one afternoon, and he said, by golly, your car engine's a bit noisy. We said, no, old man, it's a diesel. We're on a canal boat. Quite fascinating. And we were able to call into the WAB nets on the LF bands, and we worked many stations. Didn't put on many WAB areas because we're only going about 3 or 4 miles an hour, so you don't get into many. But we called in, people heard us, gave us reports, were hearing us enough to exchange signal reports, which is part of the procedure. Sorry, my light's gone out. Yes, it worked. What were the main problems? Well, main problems were physical. The aerial was taller than the canal bridges. On these canals, there's loads and loads of bridges. So someone had to climb up, drop the aerial down, put it back up when we went under the bridge. So quite a regular occurrence. Usual Curex, old man, we've just got to drop the aerial as we're coming up to a bridge, which for some people must have sounded quite odd, thinking we might be in a car. Well, VHF, we took that. We took handheld radios. Now, why was that? Well, first thing is, we'd probably put a couple of people ashore and tell them to go up to the nearest lock and open it up. So all we could do was just go straight into it and no problem. So it sped up the time we went through the locks. If you'd have waited till you got there, a lot of them, you'd never have got as far as we did. So that was a good reason. And the other key thing, of course, was to see whether the hostelries were open and whether they sold anything worth drinking. Remember, in those days, there were a lot of pubs that sold an awful lot of ersatz beer. And, of course, we had to get food. We cooked our own food. 5 of you get through quite a bit of food in the course of a day. Breakfast, lunch and evening meal. We tended to make the evening meal the big one. So we had to send people out to get food. There's a few shots now on the Grand Union Canal. Here's the Hatton Flight. Doesn't look much, but you wait till you try and do it. It's quite formidable, but if you can get those locks open in a sequence, your journey's a lot less. I mean, normally they say to you, boat hire companies, about 20 minutes to traverse one lock. Well, if you work it out, 178 locks times 20 minutes, that's about 60 hours of lock lugging, which means that 8 hours a day, you're going to spend the whole trip going through locks. Well, clearly, we did better than that. Sometimes we were held up as people were coming the other way. And here's Judith, looking a bit bemused as we'd moored up somewhere waiting to go through a lock. The Stratford Canal, well, this is quite a challenge. It's quite a narrow canal, and some of the locks are, even in those days, weren't in good nick. It was restored in the mid-60s by a lot of people from the Coventry Canal Society and the local Inland Waterways group. and some of the lock gates are not the standard beam. There's one or two where to fit a gate in, the lock beam is at right angles. There is a big aqueduct. In fact, excuse me while I cough. There are 3 aqueducts on the Stratford Canal. This is the biggest one, Bearley, or Edstone, it's sometimes called, which I think is one of the longest aqueducts in the country. So you've got to make sure nobody's coming the other way either. So it's quite narrow. You can only get one boat width down it. And here's what it's like in a lock. And they can be quite dangerous. You've got to be very careful. And a lot of them leak, like Billy-O. You've got to make sure you get the boat not in exactly the right place and get out and put ropes up so you can keep the boat fairly stable whilst the water's coming in or going out. Now, these photographs are nearly 40 years old, and what I've done is I've scanned the the old slides through a slide viewer. So some of the colours are probably not a true picture. And here's the late, there's Steve, G4EOF, and Graham. So they must have got the job of taking the boat through along the aqueduct. And here we are in the basin at Stratford. So the canal is just come out the basin there. And probably we were about to go off somewhere like the old tramway, which was a favourite haunt. It used to sell Davenport's beer. I'd been in there a few times before, so knew the turf. On the River Avon is a few shots of the Avon. Here's up by the theatre. Because different kettle of fish now, got plenty of water under you, so you can get a bit of a move on. But there are locks there, and you've got to be careful. And mooring's not straightforward, because now on the canals you've got the towpath side where you can moor anywhere within reason, and certainly moor overnight's no problem. The rivers, you've got to find somewhere to moor. So the best place to moor up for the night is find a friendly pub. And you might recognise the Stratford Theatre here. And us operating. So we've got water underneath, big steel hull, big steel roof, just the job. So that's it. That's just a short presentation on mobiling on the HF bands. And the time we were operating, the DX bands were wide open, and talking to the States wasn't a problem. I think we spoke to a friend of ours in Texas one or two days quite regularly on 10 meters. But that's all I have to say. If anybody's got any questions, I need a glass of water. I'm quite happy to try and answer.